So it's been 1 week since I've returned home from my mule deer hunt. And this year I was successful in taking a nice sized mule deer. And since that time, I have gone through a number of steps to ultimately honor that hunt and prepare that mule deer to be consumed by my family over the winter. I have cleaned the skull and kind of assessing at this point, do I take those antlers off and turn them into flint knapping tools, or do I just add it to the collection that I have? I've fleshed the hide, I've stretched the hide, and I've turned it into that rawhide form. This is kind of the spot I like to get to with the hide. Once I get 3 or 4 of them, I'll finish them all out, ultimately saving myself some time. In about 30 hours total time, I was able to fully butcher and process all the meat, get my hide ready for future tanning, as well as get that skull cleaned. But once an animal has been dispatched, there's a lot of kind of continuing steps for me. Once I've addressed those things that ultimately will rot and spoil the hide, the brains and the flesh and the membrane that's on the skull and all the meat, I can kind of take a breather and kind of move to those kind of next steps and actually utilizing that whole deer. Even here, I have 4 of the deer legs that I packed out with me. Eventually, I will extract the sinew from here and use that in future arrow fletchings, hafting arrow points to arrows, any number of tools and tasks. But these guys come at a later date. They're not going to spoil, they're not going to rot. Bones I keep frozen, eventually make a bone broth. Once all those priorities are done, there's one thing that I typically move to within about a week to about 10 days, and that is rendering all of the fat off that mule deer. And now the goal behind rendering that fat is, as you've seen probably many times, I use that fat on a lot of my knives, on a lot of the leather wraps. On a mule deer, there's a lot of fat, especially on its hindquarters and around its butt, as well as its shoulder and neck. But one of the most important things for me is rendering the fat down, use it as a conditioning agent on a lot of my tools. You've seen many times on many of the knives that I build, I like to condition my leather with a form of animal fat. A lot of my bows, on the bow strings and the bow itself, I like to rub a layer of fat. It acts like a little bit of a barrier, preventing moisture to getting in there. Even on the tips of some of my flint knapping tools, I don't want them to dry out, so give them just a little bit of a layer of fat and conditioning, and helps extend their life. Refilling and making new candles. And deer fat is one of those great resources that you can do that with. But it all comes from the fat of that animal. So the ingredients are pretty simple. I use 6 grams of beeswax, some pine oil extract, which just gives that scent of kind of pine needles and kind of pine resin in the actual mixture. A burner of some sort, any sort of burner will do, and a pot. As far as the size of the pot, I mean, this is kind of like a smaller pot. This is one of those pots from Uber even, but I pretty much mix things in consistency with my pot size. I know for this pot, 6 grams of beeswax, and I fill it just before the top of the pot with that fat. Key thing with preserving your fats is you can render it right away, but I do recommend that it's not going to spoil as long as you keep it nice and cool. Flint knapping with fat, I like it. Go. Nice. Absolutely recommend that when you're putting your fat in your pot, try to get some smaller pieces. I mean, the bigger they are, the more it's going to take to kind of render down. Smaller stuff renders a little bit more quickly. So as you're processing, you will find little bits of meat that just comes out when you're actually butchering out the animal. You'll see what happens with those. Those essentially become cracklings at the end. And we'll get that guy in there. Little burner, pot, right on the top. This jar right here is where I'm actually going to be pouring my kind of solution of rendered fats. This is kind of my work jar. You can hear it crackling. I'm gonna add my wax and probably turn down my heat. Now you can kind of hear it sounds like bacon. It sounds like bacon is cooking. That is those fats slowly being worked down. I want to avoid too much of it burning out. I just really want to slowly melt it and just let it start doing its thing. You can do this in a crock pot. It will take a little bit longer. You can do this next to a fire where you take those big pieces of fat, stick them on a stick, and let that radiant heat from the fire slowly melt that fat and let it drip kind of off to the side. Little container, you can catch it. Little stick kind of helps you work everything around. Well, that's cooking. Work on our little project. So just stick with it. Not looking to boil it. You're not looking to do anything but just slowly heat it. Once you kind of hear that little bit of a simmer, you know you're in the right spot. Just keep letting it do its thing. So we are doing just great. Everything's melting nicely. Keep letting it render down. You'll start to see the actual sides of your pot fill up with that kind of melted fat. There's a fine stopping point with this. You know, eventually, if you keep cooking this and cooking this, you're gonna wind up burning it. We want to avoid really putting too much heat. It's gonna have some bubbles and steam and all sorts of stuff, but the focus is melting it. I'm gonna have to fill up a couple containers. It'll start to kind of look like, you know, undercooked bacon. I mean, some of us like our bacon a little bit more crispy, some of us like it a little bit more tender, pick your poison. Once you kind of get to this phase, and this is kind of what that fat looks like, you're on the right track, you're almost there. Just keep melting it down. All right, once we are good to go, and how you tell it's good to go is your fat really starts to kind of turn brown. It's almost like it's being cooked at that point. So pop it off the heat, turn your heater off, and I grabbed a jar so we can kind of see what this looks like. Now I'm going to mix my pine. Just a bunch of drops in there, a couple in this guy too. Just try to avoid a lot of that meat getting in there. So just pouring it on in. You'll get some floaters. It's not the end of the world. You get some brown stuff that will all settle to the bottom. Sometimes you can get some hair in there. Get little pieces of brown, that's some of the meat. A little bit of dirt. But just slow and steady. Nice. That's what we're looking at as far as the leftovers. A little bit of a mix. Liquid gold. Nice little pine smell to it. We'll let these two guys cool. So when I'm looking to kind of test the consistency, once it's been cool for a little bit, kind of stick my finger in there and see how kind of quickly it dries. Meaning, am I gonna kind of get like a whitish coloring? How does it feel in between my fingers? It should feel pretty smooth and kind of not too tacky. So when I apply it to a knife, I can really kind of rub it in and I can see that that fat is penetrating that layer of leather. There we go. That's what I'm looking for right there. Once this fat dries, it's going to kind of congeal back in that solid form. That's kind of what you want, because you can just kind of scoop up bits of it with your finger and then work it into your leather. And that adds so much. It doesn't smell like rotten deer fat or anything to that extent. It's got that nice little pine smell mixed with some yummy bacon, even though it's deer fat. That's what you're looking to do with that rendered fat on your handles of your stone blades. Let's do the sheath. Beautiful. This little Osage 36-inch bow. Just a little bit on the back. It allows me to kind of really rub it into that wood. And the reason why I do this on my bows is if I'm ever going from a warm environment where it's dry to kind of a more humid environment, I want to avoid a lot of moisture getting into the wood. It's going to lose some of its draw weight, and putting a layer of fat mixed with a little bit of wax really helps that out. Take the remnants that's on your hands, work it through that string. It's not a bad chapstick. If you're out in the bush and you need a little something to go over the lips, you will appreciate this greatly. Nice. Next to the lips, you got the beard. Put some in your hands. Liquid or that kind of solid form. This is probably one of the best beard balms, beard oils that you could come up with. Really makes a difference, especially when it's dry out. Getting a little of this in the old beard. Also, if your hands are dry and cracked, a little bit of that fat on there, a little bit of that wax that's in the fat, with that hint of pine, you can't go wrong. My flint knapping tools, just a little bit up on that head. It's going to give a little bit more moisture. It's not going to become as brittle. Lastly, making tinder wicks. I've got some videos on here making tinder wicks, but even dipping your tinder wick and just kind of working it into those fibers. If you're making a candle, this is how you make your wick. And we'll leave this end with absolutely nothing. This one is lit. It will stay lit. Let's try to light it off of this one. Come on. You can just even see the flame comparison. The one end that's got some fat on it, I just dunked it in, is gonna burn. This one on my right, it's little, keeps going out. This is how you make your tinder wicks, your wicks for candles, how you make little fire extenders. Come on. Look when they're lit, just the flame difference. A little bit of fat will go quite a long way if you're trying to make a candle or even get a flame going in an actual fire. For all my blades that have the potential of rusting, I just want a little bit of extra protection. Throw some of it on there. It's going to help prevent that metal from oxidizing and just give you a little bit of something extra on there. You don't have to do it with all your blades, but you know, if I'm going to a tropical environment and there's a lot of humidity, especially on my boma, it can receive some rust. A little bit of fat, be the same way as if you're using a form of oil on there. It's going to help extend that life and prevent that rust from appearing on those blades. All right, take a look now. It's getting into that solid form. That's right there is what we're wanting. All right, that is it. That is how I render deer fat for multiple uses, from beard to lips, to bows, to my tools, to knife blades, to leather, even making a tinder wick or some form of a candle. It is a great resource, and I felt very fortunate after my last mule deer hunt to drop a buck that had a lot of fat on it. All it is, fat, a little bit of wax, some of that pine extract. Throw it in a couple different size containers, and I'm good to go. All right, that is rendering animal fats. Appreciate you watching.